She starts asking for what she wants in other areas of life. She stops apologizing for having preferences. She trusts her own perceptions more than outside opinions. All of this from finding one small spot on her own body. That is not just pleasure, that is permission to take up space. There is a quiet price that millions of women pay every single day. They try every standard technique, every recommended position, every toy that worked for their friends. And still, something feels unfinished. Not painful, not numb, just missing. So they do what most women do when they cannot find the problem. They blame themselves. Too complicated, too much in their head, too broken to fix. This is the silence tax, the cost of not having a name for something. When you cannot name a spot, you cannot ask about it. You cannot search for it. You cannot tell a partner to adjust by 2 centimeters in a specific direction. You just live with the quiet assumption that everyone else figured something out that you did not. That assumption eats away at self-esteem slowly, over years, in ways most women do not even notice until they suddenly discover they were wrong. The moment a woman learns that this spot exists and has a name, half the shame evaporates immediately. She was not broken. She was not too complicated. She was just missing one piece of anatomical information that no one ever handed her. That is not her fault. That is a collective silence passed down through generations of incomplete sex education and embarrassed whispers. Naming something changes your relationship to it. Suddenly you have a word to put on your curiosity. You can say out loud, even just to yourself, I am going to explore the A spot tonight. That sentence feels completely different from I hope something good happens. One is vague hope. The other is informed intention. An informed intention is what turns accidental discovery into reliable knowledge. No more guessing. No more wondering if you are the only one. Just clear, kind, factual information that should have been yours all along. So here is where we land. This whole conversation was never just about one anatomical spot on one wall inside one part of the body. It was about what happens when information goes missing, when silence fills the gap instead. Women have been told for generations that their pleasure is complicated, mysterious, hard to find, or just not that important. None of that is true. What is true is that the map was incomplete. You now have a name, you have a location, you have the psychological piece about safety and surrender. You know about the vagus nerve and why deep, slow pressure feels different. You understand the confidence loop that happens when you trust your own body. And you recognize the silence tax that so many women pay without even knowing they are paying it. None of this requires you to be an expert tomorrow. It just requires you to be curious, to give yourself permission to explore without a deadline or a performance review, to breathe, to touch differently, to stop assuming you are the problem when a technique does not work. The number one female pleasure spot that most people do not know about is not magic. It is just anatomy that got overlooked. And now it is not overlooked anymore. What you do with that information is entirely up to you, but at least you have it. That alone is more than so many women ever receive. Go gently. Stay curious. Your body was never the mystery. The silence around it was. If this video added one new insight to your journey, hit like and subscribe to Feminine Insight. And comment the word awaken below, because that's exactly what happens when you stop guessing and start knowing. There's a spot inside a woman's body that, if touched correctly, can make her arch off the bed, lose her train of thought, and produce more natural lubrication in 30 seconds than an hour of foreplay. And most people have never even heard of it. Not the G-spot, not the clitoris. This is the anterior fornix erogenous zone, the A spot. And here's the quiet devastation. The women who know it exists often discovered it by accident while alone, because no one told them. No anatomy class, no magazine quiz, no whisper between friends. The silence around this spot has convinced countless women that their pleasure has a ceiling. It doesn't. The ceiling was just never named. Think about what that silence does to a female brain. She tries everything right, the positions, the timing, the toys, and still, something feels like a door that won't open. So she assumes the door isn't there. She lowers her expectations. She starts faking not just sounds, but interest. That's not a body problem. That's an information problem wrapped in a shame cloak. The A-spot sits less than 2 inches in, on the upper wall toward the belly button. Unlike the clitoris, which says fast and focused, the A-spot says deep, slow, and patient. It doesn't beg. It waits. And when it's awakened, it releases a flood of fluid that changes the entire sensory landscape. Not just for her, but for the experience itself. Here's the psychology she needs to hear. You are not too complicated. You were just given an incomplete map. Welcome back to Feminine Insight, the place where we quietly unpack what no one told you about your own body. Today, we're talking about a deeply overlooked pleasure zone, why most women discover it by accident, and what changes inside your brain when you finally give yourself permission to explore without pressure. If you're new here, go ahead and hit like and subscribe so you never miss another real conversation about female psychology and the bodies we actually live in. Let's talk about the A-spot. Its full name is the anterior fornix erogenous zone, but don't let the science words intimidate you. It's simply an area of sensitive tissue located about 1 to 2 inches inside the vagina, on the upper front wall. So if you're lying on your back, you'd reach slightly upward toward your belly button. What makes this spot different is how it responds to touch. The clitoris tends to like fast, direct, rhythmic pressure. The A-spot is the opposite. It prefers slow, deep, broad stimulation with less intensity. Think of it as the patient listener in the room rather than the eager talker. When you find it, you might notice a slightly bumpy or ridged texture, almost like the roof of your mouth. Here's the part that surprises most women. Touching this area can trigger a near instant release of natural lubrication, often within seconds. Not just a little either. It's a distinct fluid that feels silkier than regular arousal moisture. Many women describe it as their body suddenly opening up rather than just getting wet. The psychological side matters just as much. You cannot find this spot while stressed, rushed, or treating it like a test. Your nervous system needs to feel safe and curious. That's why so many women stumble on it alone first. Because alone, there's no pressure to perform or arrive anywhere on a timeline. It's simply exploration without a goal. Let's break down the psychology behind why so many women miss this spot entirely. It has nothing to do with anatomy and everything to do with how the female brain processes pleasure under pressure. When you feel watched, evaluated, or even just subtly rushed, your nervous system shifts into what psychologists call performance mode. In that state, your brain prioritizes safety over sensation. Blood flow moves away from deeper tissues, and the vaginal walls can actually tense up. That tension is the real gatekeeper. The A-spot sits in an area that requires the pelvic floor to be soft, not clenched. But most women have spent years unconsciously bracing during intimacy. Not because anything is wrong, but because they learned early that their pleasure comes second. So their body learned to protect them by numbing deeper zones. It's a smart survival response, just not one that leads to fireworks. Here's the hopeful part. You can retrain this response. The moment you give yourself permission to explore without any destination, no orgasm requirement, no time limit, No need to perform enjoyment. Your brain receives a powerful signal: safety. And safety is the only password that unlocks this spot. Women who discover it almost always describe the same mental shift. They stopped trying to feel good and started simply noticing what was already there. That tiny switch from chasing to receiving changes everything. Not because the spot moved, but because your brain finally let you feel it. Well, here's something interesting about how most women actually find this spot. It almost never happens during a planned, goal-oriented session. Instead, women describe discovering it by accident. Maybe they were alone, half distracted, and their fingers just wandered somewhere they hadn't paid much attention to before. Or they shifted their hips slightly during solo play and suddenly felt a completely different kind of sensation. Not sharper, but deeper. Almost like an echo. The same thing happens with partners sometimes, but only when both people aren't trying hard. A lazy Sunday morning, a position where she tilted her pelvis back just a few degrees, a moment where he stopped moving and just held still while she adjusted herself. That tiny accidental shift is often the moment. And because no one was performing or chasing an outcome, her brain stayed relaxed enough to actually register the feeling. This accidental discovery pattern tells us something important. The A-spot isn't hidden in a complicated way. It's hidden by the way we usually approach pleasure. When we treat intimacy like a checklist or a technique to master, our muscles subtly brace, our breathing gets shallower, and our attention narrows. That narrowed attention skips right over slow, deep, diffuse sensations. You only notice the spot when your mind is loose and your body isn't being told what to feel. So many women have already brushed against this spot hundreds of times without realizing it. They just weren't in the right mental state to recognize the sensation as pleasure. It felt different, so they assumed it was nothing. That's the quietest tragedy of all. This is where things get really fascinating from a body standpoint. The A-spot connects to a completely different nerve pathway than most other pleasure zones. The clitoris and the G-spot send signals up through the spinal cord. That is the usual route. But the A-spot and the deeper cervix area can actually communicate with the brain through the vagus nerve, which runs entirely outside the spine. Why does that matter? Because it explains stories that have confused doctors for decades. Some women with complete spinal cord injuries can still have orgasms. Not phantom sensations, but real full-body climaxes. For a long time, no one understood how. Now researchers believe the vagus nerve is the answer. It bypasses the injured spinal cord entirely and carries pleasure signals up through the abdomen and chest directly into the brainstem. For women without injuries, this same pathway creates a different kind of orgasm. Women who have experienced A-spot stimulation often describe it as less sharp and localized than a clitoral orgasm. They say it feels warmer, slower to build, more like a wave spreading outward from the pelvis through the belly and down the thighs. Some even feel it in their throat or behind their eyes. That is the vagus nerve at work, scattering the sensation across a wider map of the body. The moment she accidentally discovers a completely new sensation, a quiet confidence clicks into place. She realizes that her body holds secrets even she did not know. That realization is surprisingly powerful. It rewires the internal conversation from "what is wrong with me" to "what else haven't I noticed yet?" That curiosity is the opposite of shame. And shame is what usually kills pleasure before it even starts. This confidence loop feeds on itself. Once she trusts that her body has hidden layers, she stops performing enjoyment and starts genuinely exploring. She becomes willing to touch differently, breathe deeper, and take more time. She also becomes more honest about what she actually feels versus what she thinks she should feel. That honesty is rare. Most women have been faking not just sounds, but entire emotional responses just to avoid awkward conversations. When she breaks that pattern, the freedom spreads beyond the bedroom.